you. Just taking this off to see my presentation. Thanks so much. It's great to be here. So today I'll be discussing Canada's use of autonomous sanctions, opportunities for improved coherence and alignment with allies. So just to provide an overview of what I'll talk about today. So first I'll provide an overview of Canada's autonomous sanctions legislation and just how it's been used in recent years. And when I say recent, I mean 2017 to 2021. Then I'll go into some key themes, key challenges, and I'll end by discussing some policy recommendations. So first of all, why is this important? So the use of sanctions by Canada and its allies has significantly increased over the last 30 years. And of course, sanctions have now become incredibly important in the current context of Russia's attack on Ukraine. So in this current context, but even before this situation began to unfold, it was really expected that the demand for the use of autonomous sanctions would only continue to increase, since we're in sort of a changing world order that pits more globally minded states like Canada against more nationally minded states. Additionally, Russia and China, as P5 members of the UN Security Council, have a veto power, of course, and so no UN measures or UN sanctions can be used to address their behavior. So in this context, autonomous sanctions, meaning those that are imposed by individual states using their own legislation, but often in coordination with one another, have really become the key alternative to UN measures. Yet there's currently limited research on Canadian sanctions in general, and even less that studies the JFAC-FOA, which is also called Canada's Magnitsky Act, since it was just adopted in 2017. So we don't know a lot about why Canada chooses to sanction in particular cases and not others, how it chooses its targets, and for what reasons. And this is because a lot of the decision-making surround Canada's use of sanctions is actually subject to cabinet confidentiality, which means that these decisions are not shared with the public. And the information that is shared with the public is often not shared in a very coherent way that's easy to understand. I also just mentioned that we just recently adopted the Magnitsky Act in 2017, whereas our old legislation, the Special Economic Measures Act, has been around since 1992. And yet now, the CEMA legislation continues to be preferred to the JFAC-FOA, which has actually remained unused in over 3 years, which brings into question its utility. Notably, there's also a legislative requirement to review both pieces of legislation before October of 2022. So now is a great time to be looking into Canada's sanctions and its use of the legislation over the past few years to understand how we can sort of improve things moving forward. So I'd like to start off by discussing qualifying circumstances, which is also sometimes known as the triggering mechanism, because it describes when the legislation can be used. So you'll see here that there's the CEMA legislation, which is the Special Economic Measures Act, the older legislation, and then we have the JFAC-FOA, which was just adopted in 2017, and it's also known as the Magnitsky-style legislation. So as of 2017, Canada would have these two choices between the two pieces of legislation when resorting to the use of autonomous measures. And what I mean by that is that we're not talking about its other legislation, which is used only when trying to comply with mandatory United Nations sanctions that are agreed to by the UN Security Council. Those are mandatory, whereas this is autonomous, meaning that Canada has a choice whether or not to enact the legislation. So as you can see here, the CEMA legislation can be used under 4 circumstances, whereas the JFAC-FOA can only be used in 2 circumstances. So you can see already that the JFAC-FOA has a little bit more narrow use. You can also see that there's some overlap in terms of when they can be used. So both legislation can be used to address human rights violations, and both can be used to address corruption, although there's slightly different wording for each of these. So we know that the JFAC-FOA has remained unused in over 3 years, and in fact, the CEMA has had 5 times as many individuals listed for human rights violations under it than the JFAC-FOA since the JFAC-FOA was adopted. So this is essentially to say the CEMA continues to be preferred over the JFAC-FOA, but we don't really know a lot about why, because this decision-making is, again, subject to cabinet confidentiality. However, in my research and in examining the legislation, I determined that there are 3 factors which determine when Canada chooses the CEMA over the JFAC-FOA and what kind of goes into that decision-making. So the first factor is about the qualifying circumstances and the type of incident that we're trying to address. So in the case where Canada wants to respond to more widespread or systematic human rights violations that are more broadly connected to broad circumstances in a state, Canada will use the CIMA legislation because it's designed, as you can see there, to respond to gross and systematic human rights violations. On the other hand, the JFAC-FOA is used only in response to isolated incidences. So you can see that there's a key difference here between the legislation. And to provide an example, the JFAC-FOA, or the Magnitsky-style legislation, was actually developed in general in response to the killing of Sergei Magnitsky, who was a whistleblower who eventually died in a Russian prison as a result of speaking out. And additionally, the JFAC-FOA was also used in response to the extrajudicial killing of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi in 2017 and 2018. So this legislation is sort of designed to respond to isolated incidents like murder, because murder is not systematic. Whereas the CIMA legislation is used to respond to things like the treatment of the Uyghurs and the Rohingya. So when Canada chooses to sanction China and Myanmar, they're choosing to use the legislation that actually connects the individual perpetrators to the broader circumstances happening in the state at the time, whereas the JFAC-FOA is used only in response to more isolated incidences. So the next sort of factor, the second factor that goes into determining when to use the CIMA over the JFAC-FOA, we can talk about sort of the targets. So under the CIMA legislation, you can target states, entities, and individuals. And entities here refer to businesses. Whereas under the JFAC-FOA, you can only target individuals, but you can't target states or entities. So for example, when Canada wanted to sanction China, it might have been politically better to actually use the JFAC-FOA legislation because there you're not making a connection to the state. And Canada has this sort of tendency to not want to call out China directly because of the potential political backlash and other retaliation. So it might have actually made sense in that case to use the JFAC-FOA legislation to prevent them from facing any sort of retaliation. Because if you're just targeting individuals but not saying you're targeting China, you don't have to worry about that. But Canada actually ended up using the CIMA because they had to target entities because there were entities involved in facilitating human rights violations. And so because you can't target entities under the JFAC-FOA, the CIMA legislation had to be used. The next factor, the third factor that goes into this decision-making is about the restrictions or the measures that can be applied. So for example, there you can see that under the CIMA legislation, you can obviously apply more extensive measures because you're targeting states in some cases. So things like arms embargoes or trade embargoes, things like that can only be done when you're targeting a state. Whereas under the JFAC-FOA, because you're only targeting individuals, you can only do things like asset freezes and travel bans. So you can see that again, if Canada is thinking, well, the situation is okay right now, but it might sort of get more serious in the future, we may want to expand the measures that we're imposing, then they might choose to use the CIMA legislation because it allows for that greater flexibility over time. So now I wanted to talk about the themes in Canada's use of sanctions. We've already talked about the two pieces of legislation. We've talked about how there are some limitations to the JFAC-FOA, and there's also some good things about it, like for example that you can prevent that political retaliation, whereas the CIMA is used to respond to more widespread and systematic things. So that's sort of the first theme that I talked about. There is this continued preference to use the CIMA over the JFAC-FOA, but there might be circumstances in which the JFAC-FOA is actually very useful. The second theme that I wanted to talk about is the most common triggers. And when I talk about triggers, I mean the circumstances in which the legislation is used. So Canada actually most often applies sanctions to address the gross and systematic human rights violations and what it considers to be breaches of international peace and security. And Canada doesn't often sanction to address corruption. And this can sort of be explained by the next 3 points, which is that Canada's most commonly cited objective of sanctions is actually to signal with or to align with allies on its use of sanctions. And Canada never sanctions on its own, meaning unilaterally, but rather typically follows the leads of its allies, with its closest allies being the US, the EU, or the UK. And the reason why this connects to the second point is because Canada is most likely to follow the leads of its allies, and Canada is most likely to agree with its allies on who to sanction and when it has to do with things that are seen as universal, like human rights violations, or things that are seen to actually affect all of those states at once. So the breach of international peace and security would be something like the current situation with Russia or the annexation of Crimea, Canada and its allies are most likely to have a lot of similar views on those situations and see it altogether as a very serious incident that requires sort of collective response. So this can explain why Canada may not focus on corruption as much, because corruption is more subjective and it often has political undertones, although of course all sanctions do. The last point is greatest alignment with allies. So Canada has most close alignment with allies, meaning that the most individual names of people and entities align the most when we're talking about Russia, Belarus, and China. And again, this is not super surprising because Russia and China, as P5 members of the UN Security Council, cannot have sanctions or other measures imposed against them through the UN. And Belarus, as sort of an ally to some extent of Russia, they also sort of fall under that area. And at the same time, these are all states that Canada and its allies care about, and they see as either competitors or adversaries to some extent. So they're likely to align on these states. The next thing I wanted to talk about is the key challenges that Canada's use of sanctions face. So the first thing is just that because Canada sees alignment with and signaling to allies, and as an objective, it actually ends up seeing it as an end in itself. So whereas usually alignment with allies would be seen as sort of, secondary, because Canada would want to be first paying attention to how do we change behavior of the targets that we're targeting. In this case, Canada sees alignment with allies as sort of the most important objective, which may mean that that other part of it is sort of secondary. And this may explain why Canada doesn't have a really active or proactive delisting process where they're actively reviewing the individuals on their lists. And it may also explain why Canada doesn't pay a lot of attention to the coherence of their sanctions. And instead, they're sort of following along with their allies because, the main point of their sanctioning is to align with their allies to begin with. I also wanted to talk about some of the limits to the legislation and some of these other challenges leading to other challenges. So as I mentioned, there's the limits to the legislation, like, for example, the fact that the JFAC can't list entities, whereas Canada's allies, who also adopted similar legislation, do allow for targeting entities under that style of legislation. So this is a challenge. If Canada wants to keep pace with its allies, it's going to have a really hard time, switching between the legislation, paying attention to these really narrow details, and ultimately it's difficult to be flexible when you have those limitations. There's also really low-risk penalties right now under the legislation. Canada only charges $25,000 if somebody is indicted, whereas in the US, somebody who contravenes sanctions might have to pay up to $1.5 million. So this is really a low risk for people who are heavily involved in financial crime. They're going to see $25,000 as, not really a huge risk for them, and they might be willing to, try to do something anyway because they're not really worried about the consequences. Whereas if you raise the penalties up higher, they might be a little bit more hesitant to take that risk and contravene the sanctions. There's also challenges with consistency in information, transparency, as I've talked about, and ultimately a lack of public outreach. So for example, right now, there's no legal guides published about how to properly interpret the legislation. So if you're a member of the public, or if you're a private business and you want to comply with Canada's legislation, but you have some questions or you're just not really sure how to interpret the legislation, right now there's no opportunity to ask the Government of Canada for that legal advice. You would actually have to hire your own lawyer, and they also might not really be sure how to interpret the legislation properly. So that ultimately leads to a couple of other challenges which I've listed there, which is difficulty aligning, coordinating, and keeping pace with allies. There's also challenges with due process for the targets of the sanctions. So right now, people are not informed when they're being targeted under the legislation, which ultimately undermines the delisting mechanism of the legislation, because if you don't know that you're being targeted and you don't know what you're being targeted for, how are you supposed to change your behavior and incentivize delisting? So this is ultimately a challenge with just the sharing of information and being transparent about who you're listing, when you're listing them, what you're listing them for. And ultimately, this leads to compliance and enforcement issues. There's an undue burden on the public to try to figure out how to interpret the legislation properly when they don't actually have a legal guide and they don't have someone they can ask questions to. And there's also differences in the Canadian administration of sanctions versus its allies. So there's no detailed frequently asked questions on the Canadian sanctions website. there's no legal history to really rely on for past interpretations of the legislation. We don't provide detailed information on listed individuals, such as aliases, or their country of origin or their birth date consistently. And this information would help us when coordinating with our allies to be able to know that we have the same individuals listed. As I mentioned, there's also no disclosure policy, so letting people know when they're being targeted. And the last thing is that there's no regular review mechanism or expiration periods for sanctions. The only one that is in place is that 5-year period review after the legislation was first adopted. So that's happening this year, but hopefully that actually leads to some of these recommendations being taken into consideration. So this is a list of 7 policy recommendations that could really help to improve how we sanction and just how we present information to the public. So the first thing would be enabling the Government of Canada to list entities under the JFAC FOA. So this would help us to be a little bit more flexible and be able to keep pace with our allies. The second point is to legislate frequent reviews of lists, including expirations on regulations. So this would be helpful because right now we have some people on our list who are deceased, we have people who may have changed their behavior, and our allies have delisted them, but we're not really taking that step to do that because we're clearly not actively watching these lists and actually monitoring the behavior of the people on these lists. And that's a problem because it makes us look like we're lagging behind our allies, and then they're less likely to want to cooperate with us. It would also be useful to inform targets when they're sanctioned and to list the triggering mechanism that applies. As I mentioned, this would help to bolster the delisting mechanism that we have in place, which would incentivize people to change their behavior so that they can then be delisted. It would also be great to raise the penalties and costs of contravening sanctions, but this would have to happen in conjunction with the next point, which is to engage in more public outreach and to provide possibly a legal guide or at least allow an opportunity for members of the public to ask questions about how to interpret the legislation. And this is because if we raise the penalties or costs, but we don't provide that legal interpretation, we would actually likely be hurting small businesses and people who are wanting to comply and really wanting to be in line with the legislation, but who might not have that legal assistance to be able to understand the legislation better. The next point is that we should be providing more identifying information about the targets. We want to be in line with our allies. We want to share the most information possible so that cooperation is easier. In some cases, a random person might have the same first and last name as a person on a sanctions list, and they might get stopped at the border or somewhere else, and they might be thought to be the wrong person, which is not only problematic for that person, but it also is difficult when another country might have the same person on the list, but they're not really sure if it is the same person after all. So that extra information is really important for cooperation. And the last point is just to streamline and ensure consistency of information online on the Canadian Sanctions webpage and in the regulations. And again, this helps for the public when they're trying to interpret the legislation, and it helps our allies to understand how we sanction and what kind of decisions we're making about who to sanction and why. And I believe if these recommendations were put into place, it would really help us to remain a little bit more flexible when we're cooperating with our allies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Danielle, for kicking us off. Our next speaker is Zohra Bahrami on Afghanistan, Crisis is the New Normal.
Hello, everyone. I'm so honored and privileged to be here today and share this space with you all. Is my presentation going on here?
I believe it should be.
Oh.
Taking a second to get our next presentation set up.
Okay. Thank you. I'll be presenting Afghanistan Crisis is the New Normal today. My presentation, my land acknowledgement is missing. My presentation was put together in Regina, which is situated on Treaty 4 territories. These are the territories of the Nihawik, Anishinaabeg, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota, and the homeland of the Métis Chief Nations. And we're currently situated on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. I'm going to start today's presentation with this picture because I love this picture. It's so peaceful and calm. It's actually a picture of Afghanistan from 1970s, before it all started. When we Afghans, especially the older generations, are asked about peace, this is something we have in mind. A place surrounded by trees and filled with prosperity. The 40-plus years of war did not only kill thousands of women, men, children, and animals in our country, it also destroyed our homes, our trees, and our schools. It killed our trees, our forests, and our agriculture. So 20 years ago, when the Taliban were defeated by the United States, we were given the hope of dreaming of having an Afghanistan like this again. A place surrounded by trees with no blood on the street. Unfortunately, 20 years later and countless lives lost, this did not only stay a dream, a hope, but things turned out much, much worse than any of us could ever expect. The loss of this hope has led to several life-threatening situations for Afghans. I'll be discussing the most prominent ones, including the refugee crisis, extreme poverty, collapse of the education system, and women's rights. After 20 years of some stability, progress, and success, the unthinkable happened, and the Taliban reoccupied Afghanistan on August 15 of 2021. And these were the images that came out of Afghanistan on that day and shocked the world. And since that day, we have been witnessing yet another exodus of the Afghan people, as thousands and thousands of them are fleeing the country in fear of prosecution, oppression, and famine. Despite the lack of data coming out of Afghanistan in recent months, we're currently looking at more than 3.4 million internally displaced migrants who are in extreme need of food, drinkable water, shelter, and health care. And we're looking at more than 3 million refugees in neighboring countries. Most of the recent refugees have left Afghanistan through illegal pathways because of closed borders, difficulty with obtaining visas, or the risk of exposure for those that are hiding from the Taliban. And even when they do go to the neighboring countries, they face lots of challenges there as well, such as lack of food, lack of shelter, lack of access to healthcare, unemployment, marginalization, discrimination, and discrimination by the host countries. So an important thing to remember here is that most of these refugees know that once they do get out of Afghanistan, they are going to be facing all of these challenges. And yet they do it anyway. Not because it's a choice, but because it's the chaos that has erupted in Afghanistan, which is pushing everyone out. And one of the most dangerous one is poverty. Unfortunately, poverty has become fatal in Afghanistan at this point. We always had poverty. It's not a new problem, but the rapid rise of poverty becoming a deadly threat within a year is absolutely heartbreaking. According to the UN, 28 million Afghans are, which is 72% of the population, are facing poverty. And this is estimated to reach 97 to 98% by mid-2022. More than 8 million Afghans are facing famine. 1 in 2 children under the age of 5 are malnourished. More than 1 million children are in acute malnutrition. 41% of children under the age of 5 are stunting. And 13,000 children have died of malnutrition since January. That's 170 kids per day. Things on the ground are just as horrific. Some of the ripple effects caused by poverty include extreme increase in child marriages, increase in suicide rates, especially of men, because they burden the responsibility of providing for their families, and increase in people, like entire families, dying of hunger. And some of the distressing practices to combat poverty that are becoming normal are people feeling so desperate that they sell one of their kids to sustain the rest of their family, or to save that child from dying, or people resorting to sell one of their body organs, especially kidneys, because they have 2 of them, to get some money to feed their families. Now, taking all of this into consideration, the Biden administration recently announced that they are going to split the $7 billion frozen Afghan assets between humanitarian aid for Afghanistan and the victims of 9/11. Knowing that Afghans are going through the worst humanitarian crisis in recent history, and knowing that the $7 billion includes personal savings of the Afghan people from the past 20 years. This is an extremely unjust decision. The money should have been pumped into the crushing economy in Afghanistan to prevent things from getting worse. I'm actually shocked that the world, including Canada, is allowing for this to happen, and everyone seems to forget that decisions like these, decisions like these will only affect the average Afghan. It's not going to affect the Taliban or the politician or the warlords or anyone else. The next topic of today is collapse of the education system. Since the takeover of the Taliban 8 months ago, the education system completely collapsed in Afghanistan. While things are different for boys and girls, while boys are allowed to go to school or or a university, they're allowed to go on all levels. They are. Can you put up my updated slideshow, please, Gaha? Because this includes some of the information that I had taken out. Sorry for the confusion. Continue, okay. So boys are allowed to go on all levels. However, they are suffering because of a staff shortage, because 40% of the teachers were women, and now they're not allowed to teach boys anymore. And also because of the lack of resources, because the Taliban are still deciding on a curriculum. However, things are different for girls, as they are allowed to continue their education on post-secondary level and elementary level, but they're still banned from a school beyond elementary level. And this is affecting 5.5 million girls between the ages of 12 and 18. The Taliban kept promising that they're going to open the schools on March 21st of this year. They did open the schools, and they had it open for 1 hour, and they closed it after 1 hour. And it was a horrific day. Social media was overflowing with pictures and videos of girls crying and demanding their rights to education and asking one common question: is it a crime to be a girl? Well, it certainly feels like being a girl is a crime right now in Afghanistan. And that brings me to the last topic of today, women's rights. This is an image from the first day of the Taliban's takeover, and this perfectly depicts the Taliban's misogynistic ideologies and their fear of women. Since Taliban's takeover, the past half a year has been nothing short of a battle for Afghan women, because they have lost their jobs, their educational rights, their freedom, their goals, hopes, dreams, everything. And patriarchy is one of the most prominent features of the Taliban. They're extremely misogynistic and extremely terrified of women's growth. Most of the rulings that they have made since the past 8 months have been related women and pushing women outside of public space. But especially in the beginning, women did resist all of these systems of patriarchy, and they faced different kinds of dominations, including murder, kidnapping, detaining, and public shaming that has led to silencing them. And that's why Afghan women need our support now more than ever before, because the Taliban have not changed, and they will never change. They are using multiple forms of propaganda and information censorship to get the world to believe that they have changed, but they haven't. In fact, they're more dangerous now than they were 20 years ago, because now they have access to social media. Through our research in SIDAC, we found out that prior to the takeover of Afghanistan, we found 126,000 Taliban-affiliated Twitter accounts that put out 2 million tweets just before, in the 4 months before the takeover of Afghanistan. And this proves that having this platform drastically increases Taliban's chances of transferring their ideologies to the next generations. And sitting here today, I want everyone that's listening to this presentation to know that we Afghans need the world's attention right now. And please do not abandon the Afghan people. And also, when making decisions and policies, consider the repercussions of those decisions for the average Afghan. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And our third presentation of the first panel is by Devan, Prithipaul, Securitization of Climate Change, the Role of Discourse and Framing in Addressing the Climate Emergency. It'll take a minute to get the next set of slides up. Or are you going to?
I stand.
You can stand. However you want to do it.
There's feedback when I face the other way. Yeah, that one. Okay. Okay, thank you. Just while we're getting set up, I'd actually just like to take a moment just to reflect on some of the things that we heard on sanctions and the normal and Taliban, just to kind of pause and slow down and just think for a second about what we heard and maybe think of something we can maybe take home to tell our families or our coworkers. So I'll just keep track of the time just to have a brief moment to reflect. Okay, thank you. Yeah, I have slides too. I don't think these are quite my slides, but...
We should have the third presentation now.
I really enjoyed the last piece on the Taliban's use of, was it Twitter?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting, you know, the use of social media, kind of a juxtaposition of a traditional idea and contemporary. Oh, that's interesting. Great, great. So my presentation is on the securitization of climate change, the role of discourse and framing in addressing the climate emergency. So what I'd like to do in this presentation is create a kind of space for conversation on what this new discursive frame of climate security means in the Canadian context, and some things to keep in mind as we move forward in this new future of climate security. So I'll go through some of the opportunities that climate security presents and some of the challenges as well. So the first thing is that even thinking about climate change or climate security as a security issue, because it's not traditionally considered in terms of how we think of security. You could say that it's part of the deepening and broadening of security to consider climate change as a security issue. But even following a realist interpretation of security, we can identify climate change as a security issue. You can see in the slide that many of the effects of war, death, injury, displacement, disease, famine, destruction of infrastructure, economic issues, these are all part of climate security, and the anthropogenic climate change will have these kinds of effects. So even following a realist interpretation of security, climate change can be considered a security issue. And I identify here a few ways that climate change has been framed in the past couple of decades. The first is in global warming to climate change. So there was a shift here. And I argue that this shift, well, all of these shifts, in fact, have a kind of political economy that underlie the shift. So from global warming to climate change, we can identify that it kind of came from a Republican sentiment in the United States in the 1990s. It was Frank Luntz, one of the advisors to George Bush, who motivated this change because climate change was seen as less threatening than global warming, right? Global warming was too scary, so climate change is a bit of a more neutral term and was preferred by the political elites at the time. And then we arrive at a more modern moment where grassroots efforts, such as those spearheaded by Greta Thunberg, have highlighted climate emergency as kind of being a point of no return, right? That our actions now, it's not just change, it's an emergency. And so the responsibility is on states to recognize the emergency and at the national level, provincial level, municipal level, and to hopefully mobilize funds, right, for this emergency. But as we've seen in COVID-19, it's hard to maintain an emergency, a state of emergency for a sustained period of time, right? Here we are 2 years and already it's too much. So climate change, how do you sustain an emergency for maybe decades, maybe intergenerationally? It's very challenging. So now we arrive at climate security, which academically has been a concept that's been accepted for, maybe 10, 15 years, but it's really only recently starting to become accepted at the political level. And in Canada, it's really only in the past 2 or 3 years that we're starting to really take seriously the idea of climate security. So what's gained by securitizing climate change? I kind of identify 3 opportunities. The first is emphasizing the role of interdependency. So climate change is a global problem, so it requires global solutions. And by interdependency, I'm not just talking about helping each other or helping our allies. I think we can go a little bit further and actually say that what's necessary in considering climate security is actually almost a shifting of how we consider state sovereignty in and of itself, right? That this kind of self-contained sovereign state is some way impeding the objective of climate security. And to truly get to this all-encompassing position that's necessary for climate security, we also need a new sense of interdependency. Secondly is the mobilization of the resources of the state, and this is already being done in Canada. The Canadian Armed Forces is increasingly responding to climate security incidents, whether it be flooding, wildfires, displacement, infrastructure. Currently, the Armed Forces is increasingly being asked to take on these roles and these responsibilities. But that's a reactive position, right? That's the Armed Forces reacting to different incidents. The question is, maybe in this new future of climate security, will there be a proactive effort, right? This is kind of Jody Dean and Heron, their suggestion that maybe the military could be mobilized towards the goal of climate change. What will that look like? I'm not really sure, but it's an interesting question to think about. Also important to mention is in 2021, our Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced that Canada would be hosting the NATO Centre of Excellence on Climate and Security. So this is really a big step in not just Canada, but NATO taking seriously the idea of climate security at the, again, elite level. And lastly is private-public individual partnerships. Often it's private-public partnerships like P3. I add the individual aspect, and this is kind of as a result of my experience looking at COVID-19 and researching COVID-19 is what I've seen is that the states that have, or the government responses that in their time have been able to handle COVID-19 well, were mostly those that had this kind of coordination between governments, corporations, and individuals, really all three. And we can think that climate change as well requires these three levels of cooperation, right? There are individual things that everybody can do to help with climate change. And if done at a large scale, then this can be impactful, but it really needs corporations to also help and governments as well. So it really needs all three of those levels to be effective. So what are the challenges of considering climate change a security issue? First of all is that discourses of urgency and crisis historically discriminate against marginalized communities, right? This is often the case, and we have a nice exposition of this by White, who details the dispossession of indigenous communities in North America throughout the 20th century. And often this was made in the context of urgency and crisis. And part of this is because of how the Western notion of urgency and crisis is rooted in a kind of presentism, right? A focus on the present. Whereas some indigenous communities' conception of time is different. It's cyclical, right? So the actions of today aren't just, happenstance. It's the result of past actions, perhaps of ancestors. There's less of an urgency to fix immediately what's happening now because it's more seen as a result of actions from the past in some cases. So not only is Indigenous conception of the environment different, but even the conception of time itself can be different. And so this presents a challenge to the national adoption of climate security in Canada. And just to point out here as well, by marginalize and peripheralize, it's not just socially and discursively marginalized, it's physically marginalized as well, right? One of the big security threats in Canada is the Arctic region and the rural populations. So it's literally peripheralized, literally on the peripheries of the Canadian country. So if the response is just focused on the public good, the question will be, or if actions are made in the public good, the question will be, who is part of the public? Who constitutes the public? Is it the peripheralized people living in the far Arctic regions? Well, maybe, but we certainly hope so. The second challenge is the tragedy of the commons challenge, and this is the challenge for many international efforts towards climate change. It goes both ways, right? It's difficult to ask developing countries to pause their economic development for the benefit of the environment. And then you have developed countries which are, upset at having to contribute more than what they consider to be their fair share. And this is what happened in the Kyoto Protocol in 1992. And lastly, it's the politicization of climate change. This is a threat not just in the United States, but in Canada. I think the most recent poll I heard was that 60% of Canadians believe that climate change is real, which is not a particularly high number, but 60%, but that they disagree on how to address it, right? And this represents a social cleavage that you see in different provinces and across political affiliations. So this really presents a challenge with large-scale national adoption as a security issue when some people don't even agree that it's real, right? This is very challenging. And although we have now a leader who is sympathetic to the idea of climate security, this may not be the case always, right? So this is a challenge. So in conclusion, I didn't really want to come here to tell you so much information. Rather, I really want to try and create a bit of a conversation, because I kind of identify us as being a bit on the ground floor here of climate security, right? The future is very uncertain. It's open to contribution. So I hope that all of us, whether it be academics, researchers, practitioners, maybe working in government, that we can add our voices to this conversation of climate security and do the work of imagining more fluid versions of security, which, these are my recommendations. Firstly, allow for a degree of self-determination. This is particularly important for those marginalized, peripheralized communities to develop solutions which are effective on a global scale, but are sensitive to the needs of the local communities. Mobilize the resources of the state, work with the state, private corporations, and individuals, and collaborate at different levels of organization, the international, national, provincial, and local. So I think that's for my presentation. I forgot to mention, I also speak French, je parle français, alors je peux répondre aux questions en français ou en anglais. So I think that's it for me. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present. Thank you.
Thank you. We've received at least one question from the internet, so we'll start with that. And then if anybody in the room wants to ask questions, you can line up at the microphone. So the first question is, should Canada consider unilateral sanctions in the case where the allies are reluctant to engage in sanctions? So this one's first for Danielle.
Okay, great. So you can hear me through the mask. So this is an interesting question. So I had mentioned in my presentation that, Canada doesn't typically enact sanctions on its own, which would mean unilaterally. And this is mostly because of its concern about retaliatory measures. And Canada has sort of been on the receiving end of some retaliatory sanctions, in particular from Russia and China. Members of Parliament have been sort of sanctioned in retaliation for Canada's sanctions. And sometimes these are not very serious, but sometimes Canada is worried about it. Like, for example, even without applying sanctions, Canada actually just put out a tweet once criticizing what was happening in Saudi Arabia related to the extrajudicial killing of Jamal Khashoggi, the Saudi journalist, as I mentioned before. And this resulted in a really strong response from Saudi Arabia, primarily because a lot of Canada's allies didn't come out with that same message. And they weren't really all speaking at once with that message. So they actually requested that all international students sort of get out of Canada immediately. And that was a huge number because I believe that they were actually constituting a huge number of Canada's international student population in the year when this happened. And so Canada is really concerned about these sort of retaliatory measures. So in order to, I don't think Canada ever would be doing it. The question of should Canada be acting unilaterally, I don't think it would be maybe the best policy, just because, as I mentioned, Canada also has an issue with coherence. And so if they were to take sort of a more strategic approach to sanctioning, and it develops sort of a policy around that, and this is the countries that we're going to look at, or this is sort of the thing that we're going to sanction for, that might make sense, but I think they would still be concerned about those unilateral measures. Thank you.
Thank you. And while we wait for the collection of other questions, I've got questions for all of you. But since you already had a chance to answer one question, I'll go on to Zohra's, which is, we face a situation now where we want to help the Afghan people. We don't want to help the Taliban government, and the Taliban government is not one in which we can really use the sanctions that Danielle talked about targeting individuals. So how do we try to navigate between the two of helping the Afghan people, or should we just give up on punishing the Taliban, or trying not to empower the Taliban and just focus on the Afghan people, even if it means that the Taliban can rake off some of the money? I mean, what would you recommend?
That's a really good question, and I have been thinking about this throughout this whole thing. I promised myself to not answer all questions what I don't know, but this is an extremely complicated situation. The The outcome of the Taliban's takeover within the past 8 months from the world has been just avoiding the problem. So basically the world is like, we don't see this, so we're not going to deal with it. And it might disappear. It's not disappearing. It's actually making things much worse. So probably negotiating with the Taliban to find ways that will benefit the people. And negotiation in no way determines legitimacy. So just because you would negotiate with the Taliban does not mean that you're giving them legitimacy. And it's not like no one has negotiated with the Taliban before. Before their takeover, the US negotiated with them for a few good years. And now that we're talking about the lives of 40 million people, I think it is important to start those negotiations again and find the middle ground where so many people don't have to suffer because of it. I mean, we do have humanitarian aid, and it's great that we have it. It's providing relief. At the same time, because of the destabilization of the economy in Afghanistan, even most of the humanitarian aids face a lot of challenges in doing what they want to do because they can't access their funds. So even if we have the humanitarian aid, they can't really do a lot. And we're not talking about a small number of people. So even if they do have access to all of these fundings and they do as much as they have the ability to, they can provide relief for a whole 40 million population. So I think negotiations would probably solve at least a little bit of the problem.
Sure, thank you.
Yeah.
We have somebody from the audience who wants to ask a question. Yeah?
Hopefully the audience can, if not, that's fine. I have a question for Devan, or I'm not sure.
Yeah, Devan.
Please. So you mentioned at some point the alternative conception of time, that you ascribe to some Indigenous communities. I was wondering how that actually complicates the discourse of urgency and emergency that you discussed in that same instance. Like, what does that actually mean for policy in Canada in the here and now? Because, I mean, speaking frankly, I always view that as a positive development, this sense of urgency, which may compel action as opposed to delay. So this is the first I'm hearing of that, but please, your thoughts.
Yeah, this is a good question. The alternate conception of time, and I'm not an expert on Indigenous issues or Indigenous epistemologies. There are others at the University of Alberta, where I'm from, that are much better versed in it. In the context of this, though, I think it's a little bit how. Actually, I have a slide on it, but maybe it's too late for my slides. I have like extra slides that I sometimes put for questions, and it's, I think, in one of my extra slides, but maybe it's too much. So I think what it is that when you get into a discourse of urgency and crisis, I think the challenge and what we want to avoid is, maybe what Agamben calls the suspension of juridical order, right? When things become suspended, when the normal order of things become suspended, and you get kind of a judicial overreach, or you get extraordinary measures which get made in the name of urgency and crisis. And that historically, these extraordinary measures have dispossessed Indigenous communities. And, it's interesting. I think there's an emerging scholarship in Canada about how at the federal level, there's a kind of conflict between some conservation efforts and environmental conservation and Indigenous communities. Like the creation of national parks sometimes dispossesses Indigenous communities and interrupts traditional hunting or fishing practices. So I think the Indigenous conception of time, I think it just goes against that kind of urgency and crisis and doesn't view, it also is intimately connected to the Indigenous view of the environment, right? Not as a separate entity totally eliminated from the liberal subject, but more sometimes even as a part of the body, right? This is Isabel Altamirano Jimenez's idea of body land, right? Of the land as being very much an extension of the body. So I think they're kind of interconnected, the idea of Indigenous ideas of the land and of time, and how this is fundamentally different than the Canadian than the state or than the Western conception of either of those two concepts. So I think it's just being aware of, or being cautious not to make these kind of extraordinary, extrajudicial, or overreaching decisions in the name of urgency and crisis, but rather to very much keep in mind that kind of consulting process, which is sometimes seen as too slow or administrative burden, but is very important in cases like this.
We have a question from the internet. How do we combat the Taliban's use of social media?
So, unfortunately, this wasn't studied very well. Our research at SciDec was one of the first of its kind that actually very closely went in and studied the Taliban's use of social media. And we are excited to see, once we publish our report, we're excited to see how especially Twitter, because we really worked hard on Twitter, because that was one of the platforms mainly used by the Taliban. So we are excited to see what they are going to do about it, or what their actions will be. At the same time, creating dominant narratives or even counter narratives to fight the social media, or to fight the ideologies put out by the Taliban. So basically, giving the Afghan people access to understand that these are ideologies, they're being brainwashed and all of that, and giving them a space to, which basically goes back to education. That's why education is so important, because if you don't get a proper education, you just know how to read and write, and you can't really comprehend properly. This will be more effective, because people will just read and they could just write and they will just understand what they're being told, which is why we have to put a lot of focus on getting the next generations to get a good education so that they can comprehend for themselves and they understand that the things put out by the Taliban are not true or not fall for it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
We have another question from in here.
Yes, hello. It's for Devan. I had a question because at first when you were talking about the framing of climate security and how the framing around climate has changed, I was actually really surprised because I thought climate change, the term, came around because it was more representative of what's going on, because I feel global warming is oh, the planet is just getting hotter, right? Whereas climate change, it encompasses more some places are getting colder, there's floods, there's fires, that sort of thing. So why, because again, I thought it was more encompassing of the reality, but you said it was more to make it less threatening. So I guess why did the U.S. government or the governments think that this would be less threatening than global warming, and what were the specific circumstances around the changing of the framing in the 90s?
Yeah, this is a good question. So there's been a lot of discursive changes around climate change, right? Because we have an event which is not a social construct, right? A real kind of natural event occurring, and then we have ways of talking about it, right? Which change over time. And you're right that there's a scientific aspect to climate change, and recognizing that it's not just warming, but it's kind of a bit more complicated than that. But I think I was referring to the popularization of the term, right? Which in the American context was this advisor to George Bush, Frank Luntz, who suggested this change. And I think in making it less threatening, it was part of their efforts to not have to necessarily put so many restrictions on corporations, and to almost shift the burden more to individuals. And in fact, this is, I think, even the idea of carbon footprint. I think this idea itself was popularized, I think, by BP. And this was their effort to, again, move the responsibility onto individuals that, oh, it's your carbon footprint, you need to do things, instead of having the corporations responsible for it. So in each kind of word or phrase, what I want to show is that there's a kind of a political discourse that underlies this change. Same with climate emergency. This is, again, a kind of political discourse, and now with climate security. So although the science has been mostly consistent for the most part, how we've talked about it has changed very much. And I think it's just important, it's interesting to think of what this new way of talking about it, climate security, what are the opportunities that this presents? And I think that there are many, but there are also the important challenges. And you can think that the other frames like carbon footprint, well, this also has some opportunities and some challenges. Same with global warming, climate change, and climate emergency. Yeah, thank you.
Danielle, you've been writing about sanctions for a while now, and now as you complete your project, you find more cooperation on sanctions than we might have expected against the Russians in the light of this attack last month, 2 months ago now. So looking now at what we're doing to what the international community, or at least some segments of the international community are doing, how is the framework that you've been building and looking at make sense of what we're seeing, very, very recently?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So when I was looking mostly at, Canadian sanctions legislation, and I think my research, it's interesting because I finished my thesis research right like 2 days before all of these things sort of started to happen. And looking back at it now, I think what I found about Canada's preference to use the Special Economic Measures Act, it actually makes sense. Like Canada continues to use the legislation that's a bit more flexible. So we saw that Canada used the CEMA legislation because it allows for a bit more creativity with the types of measures. So for example, something you would never be able to do under the Magnitsky-style legislation is to, prevent ships coming from Russia from docking in Canada. And that was something we've actually not really done before in general with our sanctions. And we're not even really sure how to enforce that. But it's kind of just showing that, again, the CEMA legislation is preferred. It makes more sense. And I think that, Canada cooperates with its allies most frequently as it relates to Russia, as I said, Belarus and China, at least in the last few years. And, the alignment with allies in relation to the annexation of Crimea was really similar. We imposed sort of the same measures, but I think now we're seeing more than before that there's these public statements coming out that are saying, the EU, the US, the UK, Canada, we are all applying these sanctions at the same time. So I think the timing is really important because in the past, sometimes you wouldn't really, when sanctions weren't talked about so much, you wouldn't see these public statements. Now you're seeing, Canada applied them at the same time as its allies, and this helps to really close the gap. So if Canada applies sanctions a week later, that allows for opportunities for things like asset flights for certain individuals if they're being sanctioned. So the timing is something that's new and really important. And I also think it does open up opportunities for more alignment with allies. I think Canada is seeing that, and other countries like its allies are seeing that sanctions are one of the only tools that we're using in this incident. And so the alignment with allies is so much more important. And I think that they'll start to really prioritize these things moving forward, like the fact that we need to have the same type of information available in order to enforce the sanctions. So a lot of the things that I mentioned, like having the information about the people who are listed and notifying them. So I think that this is, obviously not a good step forward, but it might be sort of a wake-up call for Canada because its allies are expecting that it's going to apply sanctions at the same level, the same frequency. Like Canada is applying these sanctions much more often now than it ever has before. So I think it'll sort of force them to be a little bit more flexible and keeping pace with its allies Although, of course, they might not really use this new legislation as much, given the current circumstances, or more focused on the widespread or systematic issues. Thanks.
Thank you. I think what's really striking here is there's two ways to look at some of what you're saying, because when you were first presenting, it seemed like Canada was just going along with the Allies because it wanted to suck up to the Allies. But really what you were saying here is that in order for this stuff to work, we have to be on the same page. The cooperation is important. So it's not that we're doing things mindlessly just to go along with the Allies. It's because in order for us to have an impact, we have to do this all together, as opposed to if we don't do it together, then there'll be opportunities for our people to arbitrage and to figure out ways to get, to take advantage of our slowness, if that's the case.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. Yes, and we have another question from the audience.
So this question is for Danielle. I wanted to find out, what are the possible reasons why Canada is slow to review its sanctions list? And what are its implications for minorities and people like Muslims? What are the implications for them?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in terms of the reasons why Canada is, might be sort of slow to review their sanctions lists, I think that, one of the reasons is we just have a really siloed approach to sanctioning in Canada. We tend to have different organizations that are operating on their own, like our security intelligence community, and then we have the Global Affairs Canada Sanctions Cell, and then we have, other organizations like FinTrack, and they're all working sort of separately. And the only organization that really focuses on the actual policy and the listings is the Global Affairs Canada Sanctions Cell, but then it has to be approved by Cabinet. So anytime a name is added or delisted, it has to go through Cabinet and people have to talk about it. So I think, part of it happens at the policy level. Within the Sanctions Cell, there would have to be more frequent reviews of the lists. But of course, it is actually fairly complicated because you would have to be sort of watching the individuals on your lists and keeping up with their behavior, because you can only really delist if somebody has changed their behavior and if they're no longer committing the act that got them sanctioned to begin with. And so for them to do that, that would be a lot of work. But we know that in other countries, like for example in the US, because they're operating in more of a whole of government approach and they have a section that's dedicated to focusing on sanctions, they rely a lot more on their security intelligence information to make those decisions, whereas Canada is really disconnected in that sense, so they're not really doing that as often. And then at the same time, as I mentioned, it would have to go through Parliament, so it's a little bit of a longer process to do that delisting. In terms of the implications for people, Canada does have an option for things like mistaken identities. So for example, if you were a person in Canada who happens to have the same name as somebody on that list and you get mistaken for that person on a frequent basis when you're traveling, you're able to apply for a certificate to show that you're not the same person as was on the list. So there are things like that in place for people who might be sort of profiled or wrongly accused of certain things. But I think what you were getting at is more like for the people who are on those lists and for countries that are sanctioned over a long period of time, how does that affect them if Canada is not actively delisting? And of course, we can talk about all the unintended humanitarian impacts of sanctions because, we've tried to move towards sanctioning individual perpetrators more so than countries as a whole. But there are still unintended consequences. For example, a person might be sanctioned because they are a perpetrator of a particular crime, but maybe their family members or their children are affected by the fact that their assets are frozen and they can't travel. So it does impact them as well if those lists aren't reviewed and if people aren't delisted when they've changed their behavior. I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
Another question?
Please, thank you. So this is not too dissimilar from what the professor asked before, but a little more forthright. So this is for Zohra. And you alluded to this in your presentation. You said the Taliban will never change and that we should avoid giving them legitimacy, that is the international community. And I don't mean to be too frank, but in your mind, does that mean that sort of the military toolkit is off the table? That is, do you think the withdrawal was a mistake? Do you kind of lament the abandonment by the international community, or what's your view on that, please?
Thank you. That's a good question. I wouldn't actually say it was a mistake. The timing and the way it happened was definitely not handled very well, because things were already getting bad, and then one of the things that actually affected and resulted in this outcome was the release of the 5,000 hardcore Taliban members. Because once they were released, even though the United States knew that once they will be released, they are going to regroup and come back, they were released anyway. And then after they did, the situation kept getting worse and worse and worse. But the US was like, no, we're not going to change anything. We're going to stick with our plan. So the timing was definitely not great. But then again, I don't know what time would have been a better time to do this. So, yeah. You're welcome.
Thank you. We have another question from the internet for Devan. How Canada can better mobilize the resources of the state to deal with climate security or climate change or climate emergencies or global warming?
A good question. I don't presume to necessarily have all the answers to this question, but I think it's interesting to think of kind of how far you really take climate security, right? Because climate security in some states has been around for a longer period of time. Like I think of some of the micro states like Tuvalu or Kiribati. They've been taking climate security quite seriously for a longer time than Canada has. And some of the initiatives there have, for these very small island nations, have included like purchasing real estate in neighboring countries in case of a flood, for like the displacement of the whole country, perhaps. So this is very serious. This is really taking seriously the idea that climate change poses a threat to people's security. And I think of also Canada's efforts during COVID-19. Like, it's quite amazing what can happen when the state is really focused on this unitary goal in the context of people's security, right? So think of all the policies, screening, testing, vaccination. Like, it's really amazing how many resources, how much money was spent to fight COVID-19, and why? Well, it was because this posed a threat to people's security, right, to their well-being. So, what if we consider climate change as seriously as COVID-19, right, or something similar? Because this is kind of the point of climate security is to take this seriously, and now we have NATO. The NATO Center of Excellence of Climate Security. I'm really curious what kind of actions NATO is going to take towards climate change, because again, right now, it's quite a reactive approach, right? It's sending the military out for when things happen. So one thing you could just, create, and I think this has already been discussed in some countries, is to just have like a firefighting branch of the military that just goes to fight fires in different places, both domestically and abroad. So that could be one. But I think it's interesting to think, again, if there isn't some opportunity for something more proactive, right? Maybe more research, more efforts to combat the politicization. But something like that, I think, would be really interesting. And I think COVID-19 has just shown just how far you can go when, not just domestically, but internationally, when you are focused on this unitary goal, you can do a lot. And there's a lot that can be mobilized in a very short amount of time. Again, this was in the discourse of urgency and crisis, which some people have argued is not necessarily a good thing. But it does show how, if you really take it seriously, that it's a threat to people's security, then I think that there's a lot that can be done in the Canadian context and internationally as well.
Well, that's a really interesting answer for a couple of reasons. One is to sell the future of the CDSN one of our future research agendas is actually on the climate change, on the Climate Security Center of Excellence, that we just got a grant that one of the 4 themes will be on exactly trying to figure out what this thing is going to do. And so I appreciate that. I guess one of the reactions I have to your comments is, I'm not sure I'd look at a pandemic as a great example of how Canada is mobilized, because we've seen how federalism has really challenged the ability for the country as a whole to react to this. So, can you get tests these days? Well, not really. Depends which province you live in. We've seen in the pandemic a challenge between business interests and health security, right? We have to keep opening up too soon, closing too late, because we want to keep the economy going. And I think that's more a challenge for the climate situation, because in that we really have a conflict of interest between those firms or businesses that benefit by the old way that don't want to make the changes to to deal with the fact, pipeline politics, tar sands, all that stuff in Canada. And I mean, it's true in other countries as well, but it's more so here because we are an oil producing country, right? And so that's a deep challenge, and it is complicated by provincial politics because it's located in one part of the country, not throughout. And so I'm a little concerned that maybe we can't mobilize, because if we can't mobilize well in the face of a pandemic where the requirements are inconveniences like wearing masks and shutting things down from time to time, that's not as much of an inconvenience as what we're potentially facing telling Alberta to do, for instance. So I'm curious as to how you react to that.
Yeah, this is a good question, and I think I also have a slide on this. It's interesting because it's Will Greaves, I think, at the University of Victoria. He wrote one of the more significant articles on climate security in Canada, and it's interesting because there are actually like 2 kind of threats to Canada's economic security, as you mentioned. One of the dimensions is like an example of like Layton, BC, when a town or a place becomes destroyed because of climate-related activity. Well, there's a significant financial aspect to this. Who or how will it be rebuilt? Where will the people go? All the damage that's been done. But then there's the other interest of being an oil-producing nation and having an economic interest in this industry continuing. So climate security has, if you just go to the end, actually at the very end, past the references. The challenges expanded. A little bit lower. Yeah, there you go. These are the 2 kind of conflicting economic security threats, and that'll be difficult to manage. And again, this is related to the politicization, right? Is that the politicization isn't just neutral; it's because of these economic interests across provinces that are different and sometimes conflicting. So. And I'm not sure that COVID-19 is necessarily a model example, but I think it's just an example of different ways in which the resources of the state can be mobilized towards a unitary goal. And whether successful or not, it's a bit debatable, but it's an example of kind of what's possible. If you really take this seriously and if you want to devote funds towards this, it's an example of the breadth and interdependency that's also required. And again, the private-public individual partnerships, which I mentioned as well. So I think that you can just see certain aspects as being successful in it, and also some of the challenges become heightened as well. So there are definitely some similarities between, and I've drawn a lot of these similarities in my presentation between COVID-19 and climate security, but definitely it does emphasize the challenges as well. And the politicization is really a tricky one. And I have some other challenges here. The militarization of everyday life. This is a little bit what you were referring to with COVID-19. Again, it's kind of the flip side of the individual opportunity of climate change. The flip side is that everyday life could become militarized if you mobilize the military in such a way. So this is one of the challenges of mobilizing the resources of the state. Again, this question of who's considered a risky person under the umbrella of climate security is an interesting one, and very much the uncertain future, right? That we're not actually sure what this will look like. So these are also part of the challenges.
All right, we have time for one last question from the audience.
Hello, I have a question for Zohra. So you mentioned that one of the challenges is like education to like prevent the ideology from the Taliban's ideology from reaching the next generation. But I was thinking of the fact that like the reason that, you know, March 21st was it where the girls were able to go to school for 1 hour was so devastating was because these girls, these women had been used to be able to go to school, at least to a certain extent. They had that education. So how does the fact that like that was a thing, at least for a while, change how the current and future generations will, you know, think of ideology? Because there, you know, I guess was some change, like there was some progress, right? It wasn't like there was no education at all for like 20 years. So how does that influence the next generation?
Thank you. It's definitely devastating, especially after March 21st. We're already seeing so many cases of these girls between the ages of 12 to 18 actually committing suicide. It has gone up really bad within like a few weeks. It hasn't even been a month because they still had that hope. And this is a generation that have started school at the proper age and they have kept going. And so we're already seeing the effects because they had a little bit of hope of, okay, we are going to go back on March 21st, because that's usually the first day of a school every year. So now that that's gone, it is definitely devastating, and the Taliban are not really giving a solid answer. They're still like, and their excuses is that they're working on uniforms, and the girls in Afghanistan they already have an Islamic and cultural uniform. They don't need any changes to their uniform, so they know that they're tricking them or they're just making excuses. So now a lot of these girls have lost that hope. I have been seeing a lot of humanitarian aids coming up with these educational apps and things like that to at least provide a little bit of hope. And that certainly probably will help in the short term, because by giving them a little bit of hope of an alternative. But in the long run, I don't think it will be effective because on one hand, a big population is already in poverty, so they don't have access to internet or computer and all of those things. And further, this will only lead to helping the Taliban in the long run by establishing a status quo. Like if we provide alternatives, then people will not fight for what's right. They're not going to resist the patriarchal systems. And also because during this age, or in any age, like we saw this with COVID-19 when schools changed online and university and everything, all of us were missing that social piece. So even if we do provide these alternatives, it's not going to give them that social piece. They're still going to be marginalized at home. And I think that's what they're actually missing, especially during that age, like seeing your friends, spending time with your friends, and all of those things. And at the same time, this has completely taken away their hope of having a good future. Like, yes, you can learn new things with these apps, educational apps and things like that. Yes, you can get the knowledge, but you're not going to get the certification. You're not going to have the hope of going further with your education, attending university and all of those things. So yeah, It's devastating, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the audience for your questions. The way this will work is we're going to take a half an hour break. We'll come back at 3:30 for the second panel. I want to thank the first panel for your great presentations and your engagement with the questions. It was all three presentations were very provocative. It made us think about the hard choices that we face ahead of us. And taking seriously the difficulties we face, I think was very helpful to us. So thank you very much for your presentations, and congratulations on being Capstone laureates. All right, now we're going to take some pictures. Over to you, your plaques, so that way we can show that we actually have given you these things. So stand up, please.